Hello, everyone. This is another Freedom to Feel conversation, and my guest today is Julia Hengst. She's a licensed marriage and family therapist, depth hypnosis practitioner, and the author of Venus Underwater series. So this is a children's book series, and there are three of them so far, right, Julia? The first one's already out there. It's Songs from Mermaidia, Venus and Her Fly Trip. That's already available, as I mentioned. And then book 2, Venus Made of Light. That's illustration phase. And book 3, Venus and the In-Betweens. That's coming soon. And I would like to mention the illustrator. Her name is Esther Samuels Davis.
Mm-hmm.
So this is my brief introduction to you and what you have been doing, the amazing work in our reality. But the full bio will be at the end of this interview. But the question that I love asking from the get-go, even before my formal introduction, is who is Julia in her own words in this very moment?
In this very moment, I'm a psychotherapist who is trained in something called shamanic counseling. I live in Maui. I love to surf. I feel very lucky to live here and enjoy that.
Yeah.
And I would say, I had a really interesting education experience when I was in high school. I was exposed to Hinduism and Eastern philosophies my junior year of high school. So ever since then, I've been interested in spirituality. So that has been a big part of my life ever since then, just exploring, going to India, living in India for a few years.
Mm.
And so spirituality infuses a lot of what I do.
Yes. Gosh, that's a lot, a lot to unpack, really. How do you define spirituality these days, Julia?
Well, as one of my clients once put spirituality, it's anything that connects us to something bigger than ourselves.
Yeah.
And I'm very intrigued by the idea of spirituality that a lot of people in the world of physics are exploring, which is that there's an energy that's even subtler than light. And David Bohm, a physicist, and Einstein even debated about that. And Einstein thought that there wasn't anything subtler. And Bohm, who's one of the Dalai Lamas, he calls him his physics guru, said that there is an energy more subtle, and a lot of people call that spiritual energy. So I would say also spirituality refers to visceral experiences we can have where we feel connected to all of reality, all of creation, to put it that way.
Yes. So one of the things that I have been studying, have been very curious about, is the idea of consciousness, that we are consciousness. And that's more coming from Vedanta.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't really talk much about energy. They do when it comes to the mind, the body, mind, and the natural world, and the body, mind being part of the natural world. We are not apart from nature. We are nature. So, but they kind of make this distinction between energy and consciousness. That's almost like consciousness is this, everything else is happening under consciousness. And consciousness is not, or pure consciousness is not energy. So it's almost like something that because it's not an object, it cannot be seen, cannot be touched. So it's not really something that we can ever really describe because it's not an object. So I don't know. Have you heard about that?
Yeah, well, it's compelling. Consciousness, according to Buddhism and Tantric Buddhism, consciousness can be directly perceived by the mind, but there are extremely subtle states. They call it like super subtle consciousness. So it takes a lot of training in both single pointed concentration, where the mind is totally balanced and totally still, and a lot of what's called spiritual merit. So you have to create a lot of conditions to be able to perceive consciousness directly. In terms of energy, it's a really interesting differentiation you're making. When I talk about energy and energy medicine, and a lot of shamanic healing relates with the energetic world, it's similar to in Chinese medicine, they talk about the energy body has these meridians, these energy pathways throughout our body, or the energy body is where the chakras reside. So it is something that is based on consciousness, and that there's a tie-in with physical reality. But I guess, the way you're describing it, you can experience consciousness. It does animate everything. So it's probably, like you said, with Vedanta and Advaita philosophy, there are some really subtle differences between, for instance, Buddhist philosophy and Hindu non-dual philosophy. So I would say that's one thing, is according to Buddhism, we can become entirely conscious directly, which is what some people would call Buddhahood, enlightenment.
Yes, yeah. That's true. And they do talk a lot about Buddhism and the debates that they have had for thousands of years between the Advaita scholars and teachers and the Dalai Lama and everybody else there. But anyway,
That's right.
There's something about, what they clearly say is that consciousness cannot be experienced. It can only be realized. In a sense, you are it already. So you cannot really know it, because the only way to know is to be. So being that. So that makes sense to me. It really resonates. True.
It does. And one of my teachers, Khandra Rinpoche, she said, anyone who's thinking I'm enlightened, you're not, because it's actually beyond conceptual thought. So I think if you're talking about consciousness as being conceptual thought, no, it's not. So, yeah.
Right. What inspired you to become a therapist?
One thing is that my mom was a therapist. She went to grad school when she was, I think, in her 30s or 40s. And so there were a lot of, her friends coming over to study. So I was exposed to some ideas at a young age. I also went to therapy for many, many years and was profoundly helped by therapists. I was interested to go into journalism, but when that didn't, the school I wanted to go to didn't really accept students from my undergraduate program. So I thought about what else am I really passionate about? And having studied Buddhism for many years and living in India, just understanding the mind. For me, psychology and spirituality are very intertwined and very similar. So it's just kind of exploring another branch of spirituality in a way.
Right. So the books, Songs from Marmadia, and the series. So the series is Venus Underwater. What was the inspiration to create this book? It feels like it's a very important one, because we are teaching children how to uncover themselves.
Yes, it is. Thank you. And the titles have changed a little bit. It's Songs from Mermaidia, then it will be Venus and the Courage Tale, which is currently being illustrated. And then I'm working on the third one, which has to do with social media, but via the mermaid world. So in brief, I was visiting one of my brothers who has 3 daughters on the East Coast several years ago. And I had been working as a therapist in high schools for a while, and my brother asked, what are some of the biggest issues you see facing teenagers? Because I had been working with teenagers both in the Buddhist and sort of mindfulness world, and now in therapy. And the answer I gave him was self-hatred, that was one of the biggest issues I was seeing consistently. And I had heard about a conversation between Sharon Salzberg, the meditation teacher, and the Dalai Lama, where she asked him, she said she had noticed an uptick in self-hatred. And the Dalai Lama and his translator, Thupten Jinpa, went back and forth for about 10 minutes in Tibetan. And she was sort of like, what's going on? And the translator said, the Dalai Lama considers himself learned about the mind, but he's never heard of this concept of self-hatred. It doesn't even exist. It didn't exist in Tibet. And in a lot of Buddhist literature, which is really fascinating because it's 2,600 years of working with the mind. So when I told my brother self-hatred, he said, well, what do you think we can do to prevent self-hatred in my daughters, before they especially become teenagers? And my big response is early intervention and kids' books. Like I think of a lot of the movies of Pixar and Disney that are coming out with a lot of psychology in them, but that are very creative. That's how a lot of kids and young people learn. So, and last thing I'll say about it is that the mermaid world to me represents that non-dual state, that kind of source. And I think one thing that inspired me from a lot of Eastern traditions of spirituality, even though I have tremendous respect for the Judeo-Christian and Islamic faiths, is that fundamentally our nature is divine and is clear and is basically good. It's not sinful or it doesn't need saving. And so the mermaid world represents that reality.
Yes, yeah. So going back to your book, yes, Songs from Our Medium, the mission was reading the book website, which will be here on the podcast notes too. Mm-hmm. So you have the mission, and then the question was, why focus on self-hatred prevention? What you just mentioned, that was the question. And then you explain why. And then what came to me immediately was, the idea of self-love, which seems to be an antidote to that. Mm-hmm. But how do we learn to love ourselves after we have kind of established this state of mind of hating ourselves for some reason, basically not accepting ourselves, right, Julia?
Correct. Yes.
So what comes to mind immediately is if your children could be taught to unconditionally love themselves by parents that they are doing the same. Of course, they're not just saying that, they are living. They are the living kind of proof of that. So do you feel that would be what would be the first step per se? Would you say unconditional love?
Well, I think nature offers really amazing answers. And this is why I was very drawn to the shamanic view of things, which is if you look at a flower garden, or if you look at a forest, the trees and the flowers are different colors and different sizes and different shapes. So that mirrors us, that not everyone is meant to be the same color or size or shape or sound the same or anything like that. We are we contain multitudes, as the beautiful saying goes. So I think that's one of the first things that parents can do, is just start showing kids nature, because nature almost always has the answers, and reinforcing that. It's difficult, and that's why I'm bringing up social media in the next book, because it's changed everything. So kids are bombarded with images that say that they should be one particular way, and if you're not, there's something wrong with you. So that's a big force, is to just constantly reinforce that no, everybody is not meant to be one way, which takes a lot of reinforcing years. Yeah.
That's a big one, right? Mm-hmm. But when we are born, we are essentially unconditioned, right? Do you believe that we are actually, because, I hear so much about the afterlife in mind continuation in Buddhism, and also Vedanta, they mention those things. Mm-hmm. So do you have this understanding that we actually carry some of these, the conditionings from this life to the next one, and we are already conditioned in a way?
I do, and it's something, I think it's entirely possible. Reincarnation could be proven true by science. I think it's an exciting time, because according to at least Buddhism, mind is a form of matter, and as the first law of thermodynamics says, matter can neither be created nor destroyed. So consciousness is matter, mental consciousness. And even recently, the Washington Post had a wonderful article on kids in the United States who remember their past lives. And a lot of these kids are kids in middle America or Christian America, where some of the parents don't even want anyone to know that their kid is talking about something that sounds like a past life. And they Google, kid remembering past lives. And there's a department at the University of West Virginia where there are thousands of cases. So and I think it makes sense where you see like a 3-year-old girl who can drum amazingly, or kids. So many of my friends with kids, their kids have totally different personalities. A couple of my friends, their kids actually made references before the age of 5 to like, oh no, my other mother, or in our other house. So part of me is skeptical, and I think it's good to be skeptical, but part of me thinks it makes more sense than anything else. It's really logical on a lot of levels.
Yes. And I saw a song. Well, there's a poem. So that really caught my attention for some reason. This one, A Mermaid Lullaby. It's just so beautiful. I love just reading those words without even singing the song, because I didn't know the song.
To the mother we all share. Yeah, here's our love and here's our care.
Is that Purify the Day with Light? Is that one before? Maybe because I printed here, so it's not printed right.
Yeah, and Paint Our Dreams with Love at Night. Yes. Mother Earth, protect our sleep. We feel safest in your keep. Hold us tight and we'll hold you. Our love's deep as seas are blue.
Yes. Wow. Did you memorize the entire book?
I wrote it. I don't think that I think these words are being spirited into me. So I was really struck when that one came in of like, oh, that's beautiful. And like, I would want to hear that if I was a little kid. So I don't claim ownership over whatever is coming through me for these books. That's for sure.
Yes. We'll be talking about the shamanic view on trauma and its application in therapy. So that's the title, and I hope you're okay with that title for this episode.
That's great.
So, and then one of the concepts that's very interesting, that's well explored by you in so many ways, in the written form and then through what you do, is the soul retrieval, which is a method, right, in shamanic healing. So talk, for those who don't know, Julia, what is soul retrieval and soul loss, actually? Those are two different concepts, right?
Yes. So during any moment where we experience any sort of trauma, something acute, something shocking, something painful, anything, for instance, that could cause PTSD or just a big sudden upset of any kind, part of our energy body, or our soul body, as it's called in shamanic healing, breaks off and goes to where it's safe. And they say that it gets frozen outside of time and space in non-ordinary reality. And that part, so it's a part of our psyche that fragments and it dissociates. It's called dissociation in Western psychology. And the rest of us ages, but that part stays, that soul part stays stuck at that age and that developmental level. And sometimes, even if we have our adult self online, that part might still be reacting from a very young place or a very wounded place. And the more pieces we have, both of my shamanic mentors said just being born on this planet is enough to have soul loss. And then if you have, for instance, a lot of trauma, it's a lot of fragments that are missing. So a lot of symptoms of soul loss are anxiety, chronic depression, feeling like part of you is lost, feelings of emptiness inside, addiction cycles. One of the symptoms is any time where you feel like, ever since then, I've never felt quite the same, or ever since then, I feel like I lost part of myself. So the good news is that shamanic healing, which a lot of cultures all over the planet practice different types of soul retrieval, which is really cool, because shamanism isn't a centralized religion or anything. It's their universal practices used in many cultures around the world. There's a method where, according to traditional shamanism, you interface with the world of spirit, and that there are spirit allies and helpers that we can actually tune into through our sixth sense and track those parts and bring them back in, which is called a soul retrieval. And symptoms of soul retrieval, so when soul parts come back, another big symptom, by the way, of soul loss is memory loss, not remembering whole parts of your life. Because the soul part actually takes the memories and the feelings that were too overwhelming for us at the time, and they're gone, in addition to gifts that those soul parts had. So when they come back, when these parts are reintegrated into our psyche, oftentimes there's increased sensation in the body because soul parts lead from different parts of the body and different chakras. Increased feelings of happiness, more ability to feel pleasure. You pick up on other people's energy less because you're more full of yourself in a good way. Not in an arrogant way, but just a power-filled way. So,
right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. From this perspective too, I do a lot of observations with my own dreams and visions and all that memories, and I see how that can be very much experienced without even doing, although I have tried already, shamanic healing briefly. Some people associate shamanic healing with psychedelics. So this is not the case at all, right?
Well, it's a good point, especially in this day and age when a lot of plant medicine practices are really proliferating. One of the, I would say, defining characteristics of shamanic work is having an altered state of consciousness. Plant medicines or psychedelic, psychoactive medicines are one way to alter the consciousness, but even drumming, for instance, has been shown to put the brain waves into the speed of theta, which is what we have when we're dreaming. So meditation can be an altered state of consciousness, listening to music. So there are different ways to alter your consciousness.
Yeah. So yeah, psychedelics not the only way.
Yeah, you can do it without psychedelics, without any substances.
Yes, this is good to know. Another thing is, the retreats that you host. I love when you say, so participants become their own shaman and learn to do their own soul retrievals. How does it work? Of course, you are the guide, right? They need a guide. But how do they become their own shaman? I would love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah. And I want to say that the word shaman is being thrown around a lot in this day and age. I don't refer to myself as a shaman, but I'm trained in shamanic healing practices by two different female mentors. And so I say that in a friendly way, becoming your own shaman, just like becoming your own therapist is, I would say, one of the goals of good therapy is you become your own therapist ultimately. So in traditional shamanism, if there was an imbalance in somebody, they would go to the shaman. The shaman would connect with their helping spirits, with their spirit allies on the person's behalf. And let's say, for instance, if there was a soul retrieval, the shaman and their allies, their spirit allies would find and retrieve the part in non-ordinary reality and sort of spirit it back into the person.
Right.
So nowadays, there are people who are sort of blending ancient shamanic practices with sort of contemporary spiritual or psychotherapeutic practices. So that's how I've been trained with shamanic counseling, is some of these practices like soul retrievals, power retrievals, cord releasing, extractions have been adapted for use in psychotherapy. So each person, I do still think there are some power retrievals or soul retrievals or extractions where we need to do them with somebody else. But there is a lot of it you can do on your own. So when people come to these retreats or when I work with people in sessions privately, we practice these things together, but with the understanding that over time you'll be able to do your own soul retrievals, power retrievals. It's you connecting with that spiritual level of consciousness and getting guidance, a lot of spiritual guidance through the practice of journeying, shamanic journeying.
Right. How do we know the difference, Julia, between, going through the symptoms that you just mentioned? Depression could be addiction to anything. How do you know the source, the cause for those symptoms? Are they all from soul loss? They all come from that place?
Yes, it's a good question because there are three main sources of imbalance in shamanic healing. Soul loss is one of them. Another is power loss, which is when you've been dealing with a chronic condition. So if you were exposed to racism, sexism, heterosexism, food, or money insecurity, those are sort of chronic situations. That's it creates like a slow drain on your batteries, and that's called power loss. And the symptoms are a little bit different, but there's a lot of overlap with some of the symptoms, but it can just include sort of just like your life force or your mana or your chi is down. So you can't sort of deal with the world very easily, and you might literally have low energy or chronic illness, or addiction is typically we start reaching for ordinary sources of power, which can be drugs or alcohol or food or anything you can binge in this day and age, video games. And then finally, there's what's called energetic interference, which is a source of imbalance, which can be energy we've absorbed that's not native to us, which might come from our family or our friends. It might come from a religious institution or patriarchy, but it can also be cords of energy that connect us with somebody else, as well as sometimes energetic interference happens because you visit a place, like maybe where something really bad happened and you feel the energy.
Right.
So the way to figure out what is what, and that's part of what I'm trained in. I studied shamanic counseling in a place called the Foundation of the Sacred Stream in Berkeley. Shamanic counseling is a method where as people connect with their what are called guides of higher consciousness through the shamanic journey, which may be in the form of a power animal, it may be in the form of something else, like a mythical being. We ask the person's guides, is this, is a soul retrieval needed? Is a power retrieval needed? Is an extraction indicated? So basically, as one of my mentors said, we're punting to the guides of higher consciousness to let us know. So it's a very intuitive process. It's definitely something for people who can roll with that or who want to explore. How can you use your intuition and trust that there is spiritual guidance available that's going to lead you in the right way towards healing?
Yes, that's it.
And I think it usually makes sense. I think this is where the marriage and family therapy background really helps, is that shamanic practices can be seen as very woo-woo, and there are parts of it that are pretty far out. But a lot of this makes sense combined with marriage and family therapy and psychology. So we always kind of make sure it's making sense to somebody.
Yes. Thank you for explaining that. That's very clear to me as well. So I had a question about the non-ordinary reality, right? I read this on your website, I believe. Yes. Traditional shamanism says this piece of the soul gets frozen outside of time and space in a territory called non-ordinary reality. And you mentioned that earlier, the term. So I wonder why they don't refer to this territory as the spiritual, another spiritual reality. And I wonder why non-ordinary. Do you know why?
I think just in contrast to our ordinary reality, that's where we exist. But I have heard it called the spirit world or the invisible world or the other side of the veil. So I think non-ordinary is just a very typical shamanic word to differentiate between we're in ordinary reality and a lot of our healing resources are in non-ordinary reality. And to put that in like Western psychology language, one, because I do work with people who want to explore this, but they're not sure about like the spirit world and that part. They're like, I don't know if I believe in that. One of my clients calls her guides her imaginary friends.
Yes.
But so, the idea though is that, so for some people, it's helpful to think that these guides of higher consciousness are parts of my subconscious mind that have healing power and that I'm connecting to. So, whatever works for people, really. But I do think there is a little bit of extra magic if you're open to the possibility that there are energies that actually want to aid humans in their healing. Because the idea is the more humans are embodied and in touch with themselves, the more they're kind to others, and also the less they tend to destroy the environment. So it's actually in the best interest of the helping spirits to help humans connect to themselves, if that makes sense.
Yes. So is it the idea of Dharma, like almost like a destiny type of thing, Julia, that being aware of this body mind and what it's here to do? And a lot of times, not a lot of times, if the body mind is identified with the pure self, the God reality, divine reality, then it's easier to kind of navigate this physical reality using the body mind to do what it's supposed to be doing. So some people, they call it the destiny, that's a calling. How do you see that? Is that do I have the right understanding about Dharma? Or?
Yeah, that word is used both in Hinduism and Buddhism. And from what I recall, Dharma can be used in, I would say, two main ways. And one is exactly what you just said, that it's sort of like your Dharma is your purpose or your responsibility or your thing for this life. It's your sense of duty also, maybe. Yeah. But it's also, in Buddhism, it refers to one of the three jewels that you take refuge in, that you commit to if you're a Buddhist, which is the Buddha. And the Dharma refers to the teachings of the Buddha. And they say that's the real object of refuge, ultimately, is the Dharma. And then the Sangha is your community of like-minded seekers. That's also super important, which is really interesting because they say nowadays that trauma heals in community. And I've been thinking about that, like, why is that? And I think, especially if you put yourself in a good community, like around spiritual seekers or just people you can have deep conversations with, like Brazilians, or therapists, or, I mean, I'm not narrowing it just to those, but people know if they know, that we need our goodness reflected back to us, because that reminds us of our divine nature, that we're basically good. We're not, we don't need a certain type of cleanse. I don't know. We're like the sunshine that's obscured with clouds, but our true nature is like the sun. It's warm and shining, Yeah. So I think if we have it reflected back to us, it really helps us realize that true nature.
Right. I mean, I would love to hear from you. That's the question for you. How do we balance logic with intuition on a daily basis? How do you do that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And some of where this comes from is one of my Buddhist teachers, Professor Robert Thurman. I don't know if you know him, but he's an amazing. Yeah.
Yes.
He said one definition of enlightenment is when logic and intuition go together perfectly. And that it's like the two wings of a bird, and they need both to fly. And I think this is why psychotherapy or self-seeking, it doesn't need to be psychotherapy. It could be just going off and doing retreats to get to know yourself.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of us get twisted away from our intuition. If we grew up, especially, women are conditioned to be people pleasers from a young age. Fawning is a trauma response, which is sort of like extreme people pleasing. A lot of people don't know that. And when one goes into people pleasing, they sort of twist away from their own gut feelings or their own intuition and focus more on the needs of others. Or self-doubt might come from different systems that say, oh, you shouldn't listen to your inner guidance, you should listen to something outside. So logic and intuition going together, I think, is a long process of learning how those can go together. So on a daily basis, I think the body is an incredible tool for getting in touch with intuition, and not only going with the thoughts, but trusting that the body has an incredible radar. But that does usually require extracting old trauma out and clearing some of that out. And what I've discovered with a lot of people I've trained with and worked with is the more people resolve stuff from the past, the more accurate their intuition becomes.
Yes. Have you had this experience of the body kind of sensing the presence of something in a room, and then it becomes very agitated, but the mind's very calm because it knows that he's there, but not really physically. It's not something that will harm the body. So I would love to hear from you, because I've been trying to find answers. Vedanta won't address those questions. So I've been asking different people. You might be the right person to ask the question.
Yeah, well, what's called the sixth sense is it's actually a type of mental consciousness in Buddhism. There are 5 sensory senses, and then there's the sixth sense, which it's sort of like the bridge between the body-mind connection. And
Yeah.
it's something that when you meditate or you start exploring kind of deeper levels of consciousness or altering your consciousness, you start realizing that there are other ways of knowing and sensing things.
Yeah.
And definitely, according to Buddhism, there are different realms of reality. There are different dimensions. And, just as we just discovered microwaves and UV rays and those things that we didn't think used to exist, they do. So too, there are other dimensions, other ways of existing. And that's definitely something shamanism looks at as well, too. So I personally haven't had much experience. I studied the shamanic training with people who have the ability to channel and who are mediums and who have seen spirits since they were little. I personally wasn't one, but I will tell you that part of what shifted my trajectory more into the world of definitely Buddhism and shamanic healing is experiences where my body became very aware of energies that I knew were not generated by me.
Right.
And for me, it's been more of an experience of what I would call helping spirits, where it's benevolent energy fields that my body can feel. My mind doesn't really know what it is, but sometimes I get an image, but sometimes not. I'm very much a somatic journeyer, but that has deepened my faith that there are other dimensions, and if we're open to it, and we're protected. A lot of people get very nervous of like, well, I don't want to open to a bunch of energies, but there are a lot of methods to protect, oneself that are quite easy to learn.
Right. So I want to mention the benefits of soul retrieval, and I want to mention the retreat that you hosted. There's one coming up, and that is October 20th to October 26th.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So that will be there too. I'll have the link. The link will be there on podcast notes. So the benefits are many. The first one that comes from me, like intuitively, is just getting to know yourself. But the ones that you have listed here, so increased sensation in different parts of the body, which has to do with intuition, and that's interesting. Shifts out of patterns that previously seemed unbearable.
Mm-hmm.
The return of long lost memories, lessening of addictions, increased happiness and pleasure, increased sense of presence and embodiment.
Mm-hmm.
So is there anything did I miss anything? Anything else on the, or would you add anything else, Julia, to the benefits?
Increased feelings of happiness and pleasure and joy, which is actually our true nature. Our true nature is good, and good means like, I'll put it in a way that most people can really understand. According to Buddhism, our true nature, our Buddha nature, which we all have, is more blissful than the most pleasurable sexual experience we can have as human beings. It's like billions of times more blissful than that. And I think that's a really amazing sacred carrot to follow because it's like Robert Thurman says, when the Buddha became enlightened, he smiled, like it's good news. There's a happy ending. So I think that's really important when soul parts come back. Not only do they bring back maybe feelings that we couldn't handle at the time, and now we can cry it out or get angry and it's okay. But also we feel like ourselves. We don't pick up on other people's energy as much, so we don't get as hooked by the external world. We feel more content.
How do we know when we are there? From your own perspective, personally, and from having so many clients looking for that joy.
It does become visceral, though, and that's something. One of my mentors, I remember being in a workshop, and a lot of people were like, "Wow, it takes so much effort to become conscious, and soul retrievals, and then being aware of this and being aware of that, and yoga." And she said, "There's a certain point on the path where it becomes easier to be conscious than to be unconscious." And I would add to that part of that ease is that it actually becomes more blissful and more pleasant. And we actually start to feel comfortable in our bodies and start to feel like our body is our closest ally and lover. As Clarissa Pinkola Estes says, our body is our closest lover and our ally. So I think when we develop that, when we start having visceral experiences, and it does go from being intellectual to visceral, then it changes everything. That's a game changer.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you so much for helping humanity, to experience that before
It's
they
fun.
lose the body.
My pleasure. It is fun.
That's what it sounds like. Talking to you, it's playful, isn't it? Too. It's fun.
Yes.
It's playful. It's meaningful. So before we say goodbye, I want to mention again. So book 1, Songs from Mormadia. It's on sale already on Amazon. The link will be here. And the other 2 books coming up, they are on your website, nonordinarypsychology.com and venusunderwater.com.
I think I have a link to the book site on my psychology website or the Shamanic Healing Arts website. So either way, they'll be able to find it.
Okay. And I want to mention that you offer therapy sessions, depth work, and retreats, the lovely retreats. God, I love that. Surfing. I don't know how to swim, so that wouldn't really, that part would really not work for me. But it's, that sounds amazing. I love the ocean, and I see, how do you learn something at the age of 47? Maybe one day I'll try to learn how to swim again. I think I tried before, and it's probably, the body was traumatized. I almost died at some point. Lost the body. And I think there's something to do with that.
I'm sure. Soul loss. I'm sure there was soul loss there. So maybe a soul retrieval would help, honestly. Something like that. Yeah.
And you inspired me. I usually, I come from a place of curiosity, but I try not to do any healing work from that place. But when I was going through your work and your presence, because I could feel that before here, I felt like almost invited to do that. And then, the mind really became open to it. So I will talk to you. This will be interesting. Very interesting. Yeah. So I'll be talking to you off record about that. Thank you so much again for your presence, and we'll be in touch again. Is there anything that you left unsaid, Julia, for this conversation today?
No, thank you so much for letting me be here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And we'll talk soon. Take good care. Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye.